Okay, so welcome everyone to this second webinar in the series devoted to understanding and managing wood exposures to residential wood smoke. I'm Christopher Simpson, an exposure scientist here at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm joined by Erik Saganić, an air resources specialist here with the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, also in Seattle. So I'm going to go ahead and share the slideshow with you. And hopefully that's going to work. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. So I'd like to begin by thanking NIWA for organizing this webinar series and providing the opportunity for us to talk about challenges and solutions associated with residential wood burning. In the previous webinar, Tony Ward talked about several examples of residential wood smoke pollution in rural communities. In contrast, in this webinar, we'll focus on the example of residential wood smoke in an urban setting, namely the city of Tacoma. Tacoma is located within the Puget Sound urban corridor in Washington State. Illustrated here, Washington State is in the northwest corner of the continental United States, adjacent to the Canadian border. Tacoma has a population of about 200,000 people. Here it is in the bottom part of the map. And it is adjacent to two larger urban centers. The city of Seattle, shown in the middle here, has a population of about 600,000 people. And next to Seattle is the city of Bellevue, which has a population of about 134,000 people. So this is a pretty heavily urbanized area of the United States. Air quality within this region is managed by the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency under the Federal Clean Air Act. The current slide illustrates a timeline of fine particle concentrations at various locations within the Puget Sound region. These data represent the rolling 3-year average of the 98th percentile of 24-hour PM 2.5 values. The line in red at the top here represents data from the air quality monitor at a residential location within the city of Tacoma. The dotted gray line shown at the top on the right of the plot represents the federal standard for 24-hour PM 2.5. In 2006, that standard was lowered to 35 micrograms per cubic meter, again as shown on the slide. And in 2008, Tacoma was formally designated as a non-attainment area because the PM 2.5 levels at this location in Tacoma exceeded the federal standard. That non-attainment designation required that the local air quality agency develop and implement a plan to reduce PM 2.5 levels to below the 35 microgram per cubic meter standard. In order to develop an effective and an efficient intervention plan, it was first necessary to clearly understand the nature of the PM 2.5 problem in Tacoma, and in particular, to identify and subsequently to control the major contributors to PM 2.5 air pollution in Tacoma. This graph illustrates a time series of PM 2.5 measurements in Tacoma for the year 2011. Again, the 35 microgram per cubic meter federal standard is indicated with the gray line across the middle of the graph here. We can see that PM levels are highest in the Northern Hemisphere winter between approximately October and February, and the standard is only exceeded during those winter months. During this time of year, temperatures in the Pacific Northwest can be relatively cool, occasionally below freezing, and the use of residential heating devices, including wood stoves and fireplaces, is widespread. This is also a time of year when atmospheric inversions occur. The air becomes stagnant and traps pollutants close to the ground, causing pollutant levels to rapidly accumulate, oftentimes to harmful levels. These inversion events typically last for several days at a time, and it is not uncommon to have 5 to 15 or so inversion events such as this throughout the course of a winter season. We also sought to identify spatial patterns of PM 2.5 pollution in Tacoma. To do that, we undertook a mobile monitoring campaign in the late afternoon and early evening during two-week periods in winter and again in summer. This figure illustrates the spatial variation in light scattering coefficient, which is a surrogate measure for fine particle concentration. The route we traversed included industrial, residential, and rural parts of Tacoma and its environs. The orange line illustrated here is the I-5 freeway, which is the major interstate traffic route through the city. On this map, the larger red circles represent areas of highest fine particle levels. We can see that the particle levels are highest here in the residential areas of the city, not in the industrial area, nor along this major roadway. This strongly indicates that the residential areas are the major source of fine particulate air pollution in this area. The yellow star towards the bottom of the figure is one of the regional air quality monitoring sites in Tacoma, and it was the measurements specifically at this monitoring location that violated the federal fine particle standard and led to the non-attainment designation for this airshed. Finally, we looked at the chemical composition of the fine particles collected at the air quality monitoring site in Tacoma. Filter samples were collected and the chemical composition of the particles on those filters was measured. We then used the positive matrix factorization method to apportion PM 2.5 amongst the different contributing sources. As shown in this pie chart, wood smoke was clearly the dominant contributor to fine particle levels at this site. The source apportionment analysis that I just showed you relies on measurements of trace element and particulate carbon fractions, most of which are not unique to any specific source. In contrast, the chemical levoglucosan is derived from pyrolysis of the wood polymer cellulose and has been used as a highly specific tracer for wood smoke. As shown in this box plot, levoglucosan levels are higher in the wintertime residential heating season, indicated by these striped bars, compared to the non-heating summer season shown in the gray bars at the bottom of the plot. Furthermore, levoglucosan levels are also higher at the 3 Tacoma sites on the right of the plot compared to the Seattle-Duwamish monitoring site, which is in a highly industrialized part of the city of Seattle. Taken together, these observations clearly identify residential wood smoke as the major contributor to PM 2.5 pollution in Tacoma. As I mentioned earlier, the population of Tacoma is approximately 200,000 people. Many of them burn wood for residential heating, and many of them do so in old technology wood-burning devices that typically burn inefficiently and emit high levels of pollutants. In 2007, we conducted a survey and asked participants about the kind of devices that they used for residential heating. 24,000 of the respondents to that survey indicated that they used uncertified wood stoves, and a further 21,000 indicated that they used open fireplaces for residential heating. And open fireplaces also tend to emit relatively high levels of fine particle air pollution. Many people are comfortable with being exposed to wood smoke and enjoy the ambience of a wood fire. They may be unaware of, or they may minimize the health hazards associated with these exposures. As one example of those health hazards, consider that wood smoke is an underappreciated source of hazardous gas phase chemicals, such as benzene. Benzene is a group 1 known human carcinogen. That is the highest classification from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and it is reserved for chemicals for which there is clear evidence that those chemicals cause cancer in humans. It is widely assumed that vehicle exhaust is the dominant source of benzene. However, in Tacoma, we found that benzene was highly correlated with the wood smoke tracer levoglucosan, as indicated by the scatter plot on the right-hand side of the figure. Furthermore, benzene concentrations were highest in the residential parts of Tacoma, coincident with where levels of residential wood smoke were highest. The time series on the left-hand side of the plot shows covariation between levoglucosan and benzene, and also indicates that levels of benzene, shown by the solid line, are highest in those wintertime residential heating months, as was observed with levoglucosan. A source attribution study that we conducted in a neighborhood in Seattle indicated that residential wood smoke was responsible for between 60 to 70% of the wintertime benzene emissions. The health hazards due to wood smoke exposure can be substantial. Wood smoke particles at this residential site in Tacoma, as shown in the dark blue portion of the pie, represent a lifetime cancer risk of 38 cancer cases per million people. The contribution from wood smoke associated gases, such as benzene, is at least as much, again, as the contribution from the wood smoke particles themselves. In numerous epidemiology studies, fine particles, including wood smoke, have been associated with a wide range of adverse health conditions, including cardiovascular disease and asthma. Far from being benign, wood smoke therefore represents a significant environmental health hazard, and emissions from residential burning need to be managed and controlled to minimize these adverse health consequences associated with wood smoke exposures. And with that background, I shall now turn the desk over to Erik Saganić from the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, who will describe how his agency went about identifying and implementing solutions to Tacoma's wood smoke problem. Erik.
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris stated, I'll be covering kind of what we did after we did all this analysis, which was immensely helpful from the University of Washington, and it was as part of the lead up as we knew we were going to go over this air quality standard, a lot of really recognizing how much wood smoke we have, and these factors played an important part when we decided on what our strategy is going to be and how we're going to implement this. And so really the most monumental task was getting a group together, and we thought that if we could have consensus from the community, we could actually really tackle this problem, have acceptance, because now it's starting to get into more of a political issue where we need to have the general public, we need the legislature, we need a lot of people to be involved in accepting any kind of strategy that get developed. And so as part of this, we call this team the Clean Air Task Force. We had, as shown in green here, we had government officials, we had the community is shown in pink. We had even wood burners to try to represent those that could be impacted and have their voice at the table. We had, as these names in yellow, people representing real estate and housing and construction of homes that can be, as now we're talking about, impacts on potentially residential houses and residents. And then put the military base as its own category, and also the Puyallup Indian tribe, as they're actually technically exempt from following anything that may come of all this, but the community's perception is it's all the military planes, and if they're not involved in accepting some of these agreements, then no one may go along with this. So it was really key to have them on board and willing to accept all the strategies that the group came up with. And we also had representation from transportation. This is Washington State Department of Transportation, as also, trucks and cars can be part of the pollution pie. And so to have everyone at the table was pretty important here. And then in red, we have kind of the white coats, the health professionals, to help also weigh the importance of the impacts of wood smoke and the impacts of total fine particles. And lastly, then there's there's a hearth lobby, basically, that represents those that manufacture stoves that we had at the table. We had also those that represent businesses and some of the heavy industry in the region, and even the utility called Puget Sound Energy, as often utility is pretty tied to home heating and such. So having all these people at the table was really key, and they were really the most important part of this, because they would come back with their strategies to their constituents and their groups to get buy-in. So it wasn't just getting these people to say yes, an agreement on one issue. And so it was really helpful to have them go through this, and it took a lot. They had to learn everything from square one about what is air quality 101 to what are fine particles and the health consequences, and we don't believe you. And we would go through a lot of different meetings just trying to get people on board with the material, because there's so much of it. I think the process took about 9 months roughly, and we were having bi-weekly meetings, and we had subgroups, and it was a lot of heavy engagement. But we're very thankful to everyone who was on this committee to really help these strategies go through. And so they did come to consensus, which was really helpful. And when you come to a politician with a document that shows strategies that everyone agreed on, all the politicians love it, because then they look good and they put their name on it, that, look, we have full consensus. And so that was really part of the key, that we had a unanimous vote on these strategies that could get approved through all parties of government. And so it did get some legislative changes as a result of this. And so it was pretty key to have this group, and this is really where we spent most of our time and energy, was working with these individuals. As part of the process, we had to go through analysis as well. They wanted to see scenarios and say, what if no one drove during a burn ban, or what if we had no trucks? And so we'd have to go through all these scenarios and show them what was the reduction. And I think that was really a key to helping show how far we had to go, and if we didn't address wood smoke, we really wouldn't get very far. And so a lot of the strategies ended up really focusing on wood smoke specifically. This diagram shows what we had to demonstrate to EPA. We had to actually quantify exactly how much. We needed to get 9 micrograms, which is sort of this bizarre process we use as thermometers, but I think they really understood what it meant. And so we needed to get to that blue bar, and doing these strategies over time, we were modeling it would get to the blue line in 2019. But as part of this, EPA didn't allow us to credit things like outreach that were really less quantifiable. It had to be actually like number of stoves, number of burn ban tickets issued. So these are things that we had to actually quantify to try to model out. And so by 2019, with those artifacts, we could actually get to it. But you'll see we got there a little bit earlier, thankfully, to a lot of the outreach. And I think all these strategies in unison were able to accomplish this. So the first strategy they recommended was they had to improve our burn ban. So we have a burn ban program that was already in place, And what that meant was on certain nights of the year, we would issue a burn ban where people were limited, and we had a couple of stages. We would call stage 1 burn ban. So that means the older, dirtier, uncertified stoves weren't allowed to burn during a burn ban. And then we had the stage 2 burn ban, meant no one can burn. If you have even a pellet stove, it was not allowed when levels were high enough. But a lot of these trigger levels were already at the standard, so it was almost too late when we would have to issue these. And so part of their thought was we could lower the threshold. And we also have only 12 inspectors to cover a population of 4 million people. And as a result, we could only get so much coverage. And so they also thought having increased enforcement staff would be helpful too. And the last caveat is they also really wanted to make sure that those that didn't have a stove had some form of coverage so that they could actually burn during a burn ban. And so we had to make some adjustments to this program, but we call it our No Other Adequate Source of Heat program. And I'll cover all this in a little more detail. And so as part of the burn ban program, we were ramping up to basically 75 patrol staff from our 12, which is a really big ramp up. And then we would also do enforcement at night. And historically, we've only been able to do it during the day. What was really neat was we took our cameras and used long exposure photography, and we could actually see the smoke at night more effectively. And we could actually do enforcement more when people are actually home and burning. And it made it a lot more equitable because the people that are home during the day are typically the older adults or maybe the unemployed, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to be doing heavy enforcement when we have some of the lower pollution levels and some of the more distressed populations. And so having the enforcement at night was a really great improvement and even an ethical level. And so that first winter, after we ramped up the burn ban enforcement and we did all these strategies, we had 18 burn ban days total, and we had over 2,000 tickets in essence. And some of them would close based on, well, the photograph got too fuzzy or wasn't enough evidence to actually finish it. So we ended up with 1,400 formal tickets that resulted in 800 civil penalties. And the next photo shows kind of an example of these night photos that we're able to take. And this is at 9 p.m. And in the middle of winter here, you know, it's pitch black at 4 p.m. So to have this late November at 9 p.m., really you don't see anything. And it's amazing that we can do this. And we basically mount the camera to the windshield so it doesn't vibrate or anything. And you can open the aperture up for 5 or 10 seconds or whatever is needed. And it'll capture the shot, and you end up with these beautiful, these beautiful images of criminality. Right? But they're basically a really obvious form of support for your evidence of why someone's burning at night, where if you just take a picture in the dark, obviously you don't have anything, and it's their word versus our word. So it was really nice to have this photographic evidence, and it became virtually undeniable for the people that, yes, they were burning during the burn ban at this time. Another important strategy we did was we banned uncertified wood stoves, and it was actually in effect last winter for us. And so this was pretty controversial in the beginning, and we had a lot of issues with real estate and how would we enforce this. And so Oregon, the state to the south of us, has a similar rule in place, but they're able to enforce it when someone sells their house, and that's when they would typically remove it. But with the task force, we weren't really allowed to do that, and so most of our mechanism is actually through the burn ban program in enforcing this one. But it's already been in place a year, and we've seen some success in the air pollution levels. We don't know, again, which part of all this is really the result of that, but we'll get more into that too. And so, you know, we have all this heavy enforcement, and so we call that the stick, and we also have what we call carrots, so to kind of soften the blow, and you have all this kind of heavy enforcement in a way that we can transition people to cleaner heating devices and other options without as much cost, or even for free for some individuals. So we had this wood stove replacement program, and for some individuals we could replace their stove for free if you're a low income home. We had you could actually go to another stove if you wanted. And part of the thought was, if you're low income, you may get your wood for free, so we'll let you go to a wood stove again and use that, but you'd have a certified one, which is a lot cleaner. And so we'd have options of which stove you can buy, and it would be absolutely free. And then they were also qualified to get other heating options that were free, like a whole house heat pump or a natural gas furnace. And then we also had, for those that weren't low income qualified, but we were able to give them discounts if they changed to a cleaner device. You could have $1,000 or $1,500 discount depending on where you won in the drawing. And then we also had some totally free, you can get whatever device you wanted as a grand prize for those drawing winners. And then the cheaper option for us financially, but we also had a lot of takers, which is great, is to actually scrap your device. So there's really no questions asked if you brought your device, but you did have to show you lived in the region of interest. But you would get a $350, and this is all US dollars, sorry, US $350 reward. And if you wanted a contractor to come to your home and pick it up, it was $200, basically the cost of the contractor to arrive in your home. And then to address those that had no other adequate source of heat, we have this fun acronym NOASH, and so they basically are allowed to burn during burn bans, and they would register with us ahead of time, and they would provide all sorts of data like their insulation and how many windows they have, and is it single pane windows or double paned, and we would basically through that run it through a calculator with the data they provide to see if truly their current heating system was adequate or not. And so if a house maybe has no insulation or single pane windows and they have 2,000 square feet, they would potentially qualify as having no other adequate source of heat. But in turn, there were other provisions that we put in the rules when we went through this change where if you had a source of heat that was adequate and you just let it go into disrepair or unplugged it or destroyed it on purpose or any of the sort, basically that was not considered. Now you have no other adequate source of heat. You have to repair your own device, essentially. And so as a result of the program, we have now up to date over 4,200 of these devices gone. We think at the end of our heating season coming up now, we're going to be over 5,000, thankfully, through some extra funds provided from the legislature to do this. And we got another, I think, $1.5 million US dollars to replace these stoves over this heating season, and then we'll likely be applying for more money the next year. And I think to date, I don't know if I have the numbers off the top of my head, maybe it's roughly $4 or $5 million we've spent on these to remove these stoves. And another really critical component to all this was the outreach, so that people even knew this was all happening. It's hard to follow burn ban when you don't know about it. It's hard to go apply to get a new stove if you don't know about it. And we spent a lot of time and resources in this program. I think, again, it was maybe $250,000 a year in the beginning to do some of this outreach. And we had a lot of fun advertising too. We have this logo, Air on the safe side, and we had this whole theme that we used throughout. But something we came up with was these text alerts, which is really handy. So before, people had to go to our website routinely to check if is there a burn ban or if to look at the local news. We would usually communicate with the local news stations and television stations and newspapers, and it's still hard to get everyone to know that it's happening. But now with the text alert, you really don't have much excuse to not know that it's happening if you sign up. And so it's been really handy to have that option to tell the public that there's a burn ban in effect. And here's some more of our fun advertising, and we had different types of themes on leaving your old flame behind to get to these newer stoves. And you can see some of the other advertising that we did around the area. And I think they have measures of how many views, and I think we had some estimate of like 5 million eyeballs had seen this material. Many individuals saw it multiple times, and so that was helpful to get some of these messages about our burn ban program and our stove replacement program. And so I'm probably rushing too quickly through this. I can have plenty of time for questions, but you can see now, and I don't have the updated graph right now, right here, but basically our levels are still below, and after we finished 2015, thankfully, and even through the beginning of 2016, we're looking pretty good. And we are now below that federal air quality standard. And we've done some analysis to try to assess, okay, so how much has actually changed because it's the weather, or how much is it actually because people are burning less? And so we developed this model to try to estimate air pollution. Actually, back to 2006 to 2009, we were using some of that data, and our model was getting more and more biased. And we said, this is actually a great tool to see how we're changing, because it's correcting for the weather based on what people's behavior was back in 2006 to 2009. So we knew what their air pollution levels were, or how much they would burn if it were, 0 degrees C. Versus 10 degrees C. And so some of that went into it, or the wind speed, what was involved there. And so based on that model, we see that our bias in the model is now looking at converts to near 10 or 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which is about how much we've dropped, thankfully, too. And so the rate of change is about 5% a year. And it's really hard to know what was the one piece that started all this. We started changing out stoves back in 2007, but we're only a fraction of the 25,000 when we've changed out even 5,000. And that's the older stoves, never mind the other 40,000 devices that are still in use. We've changed the burn ban triggers. We've done a lot of these pieces, but a lot of that happened after that date. And some of the enforcement doesn't actually, the awareness of enforcement doesn't happen until after you've received a ticket on some level. And so what we think a lot of the actual change was really the outreach was such a huge part of this. And so I think the awareness of knowing about it was half the battle. We also did benefit from other non-wood pollution reductions. There's an international standard that was put in for ships that basically limited the sulfur dioxide, and the PM levels are also vastly reduced to nearly 90%, I believe. And so having the shipping standards and having the motor vehicle standards, we also did get some gains from those, that we have cleaner generations of vehicles, and that we're still benefiting from as well. But as you saw from Chris's analysis, still the wood smoke was the bigger portion of the pie. And so some of those don't also add up to the total reduction that we did see in the end.